talking about the question of the correct starting point for a system of philosophy, like the sort of central idea, central question, foundation. And this is part of a series of videos on how to best construct a system of philosophy. I already did one video about the correct structure. So this one's about the correct starting point, which is a totally different question. And then I'll do another video about sort of the correct kind of pre-philosophical, like the correct sort of like place of philosophy within the field of endeavors or whatever. But and I have a little bit of a cough. I might have had a cough for a previous one too, but sorry if I cough. This might be a kind of meandering one. So if you're looking for ASMR experience to pass out to, you have found it. But I'll kind of summarize, just because this topic I feel like sort of deserves meanderingness, because it's so hard to catch hold of sort of what the essence is here. But I do have some conclusions which I'll maybe just lay out in kind of summary form at the top of the video. So generally speaking, this is the question of like sort of what what is the motivation for philosophy? And there's this kind of like thirst that tends to animate the philosopher, or animates me anyway, and others express the same thing, where there's a kind of like a yearning. It can have like different affective modalities, an angst or a sense of wonder at like either things not making sense or making sense, oddly, like there's this kind of thrill, I think, in realizing that something that seemed natural or seemed absolute, perhaps from the perspective of like ordinary opinion, turns out from this new perspective to be relative or historically situated, or more contingent, and or by the same token, and usually together with that then there is some higher principle that actually is absolute, and but it's not really clear what's what's going on there, is that just a kind of like existential need that can be psychologized away? Are there really any absolutes? One is never sure. Sorry, I'm like clearing my throat a bunch. One is never sure, I guess, that one has kind of like found that secure foundation, and or what it even means to be asking these questions, because there's this kind of ideal of sort of explaining everything according to like a law that's sort of simplified compared to the world, that makes sense of things perfectly, and that's kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. And like that would be like a relief, or it would be useful, or you also like feel there's this thirst to kind of be the one who knows. So anyway, my thesis is that there are four possible starting points for philosophy that there is not not just one, um, and that all philosophy systems that have ever been created, in any tradition of thought, not just in like philosophy that comes from Greece, the Western tradition, um, that all can be reduced to one of these four, um, but that there is a historical progression that sort of yields their purest forms, or like their maybe earliest forms, and that you can see that progression as like increasing abstraction over the ages, as like one system kind of um, becomes taken for granted, then there's newer questions, but you can also see it as just an illusion, and just as the world changes, as sort of new questions being prioritized. So I associate these with each of them has a philosopher that's kind of their like mascot or something. Plato, Descartes, Nietzsche, and Balthasar, the theologian Balthasar. And okay, I'll just kind of summarize each of these four. So, wait, I said Plato, but I meant Socrates. Though Socrates and Plato are very closely connected, obviously, because when I say Socrates, what I really mean is the character Socrates in Plato's dialogues, because Socrates was the protagonist of most of his early dialogues, and he didn't write anything himself. So in the Socratic / Platonic approach to philosophy, the concern is truth, and what's taken for granted is that there is a society where there is kind of public opinion, and that public opinion is not grounded. People have ideas in their head about how the world should be that they cannot justify, and they don't realize that, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there are fake philosophers who are bad, and they're called sophists, and kind of like self-help authors maybe, or political pundits, people who give philosophical advice, grifters, that sound wise, like how to get ahead, or just preaching like bigoted ideas or something, but it's actually not beneficial knowledge, and it's exploitative. And so the philosopher's task is to not just sort of open the common person's mind, or the layperson's mind, to the truth, but to sort of defeat this adversary, the sophist, and show that their sort of false dialectic is deceptive. And so this approach takes for granted the existence of society, and it doesn't really ask more than that. And then its like key method is dialogue, dialectic, and so basically by bringing up a topic and then sort of just analyzing it, is it this or that? Oh, if you was, this is the case, you agree, right? Okay, if that's the case, then this must be the case, right? Well, if that's the case, then, like that kind of thing, where there's like a group of people who kind of are all doing this together, and that by a kind of mysterious logic or a mysterious process, truth emerges, and people sort of experience like together this like epiphany, like, oh, like this, we've arrived at this truth, and it's kind of joyous, and um, there is a kind of specific like highest point, right? There's like being and the good, and the idea of, like, Plato has this great term, that virtue is the coin that cannot be exchanged, where there is an end in itself, like philosophy, like the contemplation of being itself is the highest good, but you don't even need to really get that far to get to this basic structure of collective dialectic. And I have a name for this. It's catharsis. This is a mode of thought. I call it a cardinal. I'm actually going to go into this stuff a lot more in the next season. But well, I'll actually pause there and go on to the next one, and then I'll kind of expound a little more. Well, I'll just say one other thing, is that mode, in history, like actually, like dialectic in Hegel is kind of the same thing, except it becomes a world historical process, and the scientific community actually works this way. Like, this is sort of what grounds science, even though science is not philosophy. Something people kind of forget is that even in something like mathematics, like, there's actually no like bottom to proving anything. Like, people have to agree on certain conventions for any kind of proof to be accepted. That's part of what Gödel's incompleteness theorem actually says, is that you can't really ground, you can ground a proof in principles, but then you can't really ground those principles too. And so this is like a version of reason that is, that podcast Acid Horizon. I always think of this when I hear the name of that podcast. Like, there's this kind of horizon that is always sort of dissolving its foundations. You can always go deeper. There's, you don't really arrive at like a foundation. Even though with Plato and Aristotle that begins to be obscured in a way where the foundation becomes God. Okay, so anyway, that is one mode. The second one we associate with Descartes, and this is many years later. Plato is in like a few hundred years BC. Descartes is in the 1600s, maybe 1500s. Anyway, around then, the scientific revolution. And Descartes, so science has advanced quite a lot in that time, and Descartes is famous for cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, and the question of this kind of like paranoia about truth, I guess I should say it becomes more sort of paranoid in this case. It evolves. I think that you can give reasons why, like maybe because there's actually beginning to be more understanding of like how vision works and things like that, or there have been more scientific discoveries that defy that are sort of experimental but true, and you never could have come to it by just like sitting there and thinking. That it was obvious to Descartes in a way that it was not obvious to Socrates and Plato that like my sense of reality is constructed by my mind as representations, that are sort of responses to stimuli, and that if that's the case, if I'm sort of like carrying this little sort of TV around me or whatever, then how do I know that anything that I think I'm experiencing is real? Like how do I know I'm not a brain in a vat or whatever? And so he sort of has famous meditation on this, and he feels he discovers that there is one principle that has to be true by definition, and that is that I'm thinking. Like basically that, like it can't deny. Maybe all my experiences are false, but like I can't deny that that this experiential field is here and that I'm experiencing it. And there's other stuff too, because then he's still kind of in this scholastic mode where he believes you can prove God exists, and then if God exists, then a good God wouldn't be like tricking me constantly. So then it turns out that like science is true as well, but that even if God weren't real, I would know that I'm having experiences. Now this trajectory develops into I guess I wanted to do just short intros and then go into each, but that's not how I'm doing it. So this trajectory passes through Kant and then into phenomenology, with Husserl, and then actually like French theological phenomenology really sort of refines this. And here what happens is that, first with Kant, it occurs to Kant that just because my experiential field is undoubtedly there, it can't necessarily be said that therefore like I'm here too, or that I have any sense of what I am, or that like what Descartes wanted to say was that I have an immortal soul. And so this kind of turn of the screw for Kant is a new abstraction where he sort of discovers the transcendental, where like I'm not allowed to say what it is that's having these experiences, or that it's me, or that it's my soul, but that there is a form of experience that is sort of shared by us. And for Kant, that meant intuitions, sensory input, a kind of perceptual construction of reality out of the input, which has sensory constructed imagination elements, but it's also structured by another layer, which is sort of an intellect, basically understanding, which structures my like visual and sensual field, and also then has another kind of like line of sort of commentary, checking whether my experiences are true, so it can form judgments. And then there's another faculty called reason, which is a sort of this kind of yearning to sort of simplify, to find new to make sense of things in a simplifying way, basically. Define higher laws, which then has like reason sort of then has moral aspects, and but this is something that is sort of more subtle to articulate than like Descartes' idea that like that means that I have a soul. So it's this nuance. Okay, so that diverges into two directions. I mentioned that continuing on that trajectory, we get to phenomenology, but I'm going to pause and hopefully come back to that. And I'll say that is Majesty. But I'm going to go on to version number 3, which I identify with Nietzsche. And I want to talk about this first because Nietzsche came before phenomenology, chronologically, even though phenomenology is in some ways more faithful to Kant and Descartes. So Nietzsche's insight is sort of an additional degree of abstraction, and this I call fervor, which is basically, I mean, the basic idea of it is that if there is a transcendental subject, like there must also be a medium in which that transcendental subject subsists. And basically his idea is that our capacity to represent things is actually fairly superficial, and that there is something underneath the transcendental subject, our representations, that is noumenal. So he sort of takes a category from Kant, but what he suggests is that and this kind of changes the nature of philosophy itself, that the noumenal is this kind of like basically creative capacity to give birth to your dreams, or to sort of give birth to new things, or to sort of respond to like divine messages from the future, to sort of have to have a prophetic gift, whether it's kind of artistic or whether it's more of like a philosophical legislation or something. And I mean, you kind of have to pass through Schopenhauer to get to this idea. Schopenhauer is very explicit about his whole book. There's a representation, which is sort of the Kantian frame, and then there's a will underneath. But his idea of will is very different from Nietzsche's, and Nietzsche suggests that will is it's will to power, and that representation, unlike in the case of Socrates and Plato, and then Hegel, and science generally, where representation is actually kind of like, it's always kind of folding back on itself, thought is actually the medium of its own development, and it kind of keeps undermining itself, discovering new things. So that's a whole trajectory of kind of things getting more and more reasonable. And that, in contemporary times, that's like Brandom, maybe like Reza Negrestani. For Nietzsche, reason is actually pretty superficial, and what philosophy really taps into, and what is sort of fundamental, like you've kind of found the holy grail of philosophy when you were able to be a channel for a kind of poetry that will be understood by a future generation and will be untimely in the present generation. And this, I call this fervor. Um, it it has a lot of continuity actually with paganism, and Nietzsche was actually pretty explicit about this. He sort of saw himself as reviving a kind of paganism. He's being anti-Christian, but like um, in like say like Vajrayana Buddhism, or in Greek sort of sacred rites, like there's this in Nietzsche's in like theory, we think of this as we think of it in terms of like Freud and like cultural libido. um, like Deleuze really articulates all of this with a lot of clarity as well. um, but there is a real continuity between that sort of cultural stuff and like um, just like non Christian religious formations, basically, um, and which I identify as pagan. Um, and there is a quality of evil to it where like basically like you sort of refuse to accept um, collectively agreed upon norms, and as you sort of have a willingness to sort of seem a little evil and crazy, and to not really know what you're doing, and to be a bit destructive. But there's this kind of faith that what you're doing will ultimately be like vital and beneficial in this kind of like rough way. And this is an energy that is really surging in our culture at this time, and accelerationism. Like this is what Nick Land gets from Nietzsche via Deleuze. Um, Long-termism, basically. Um, with like that radical sense of like um, you know anti-speciesist long-termism, where like our current ideas about what's good, like wanting to preserve humanity, our idea of humanity at all is like silly, and that's herd morality. So this is a This is a real trajectory for thought. It's really possible, and anyway, that's the lineage. Um, and then I will now return to the Cartesian one. So we go back to Kant. There's kind of like this fork coming out of Kant, this fork in the road, into the libidinal starting point for philosophy, and this other point where basically this history also gets increasingly radicalized, but the frame of the transcendental subject never goes away. It just gets refined. And so, with Husserl, you have the transcendental ego, which just has sort of more nuance to it than Kant. There's a lot more focus on sort of the ability to, focus your attention, or sort of have certain moods and feelings, and relate. There's this kind of phenomenality of just phenomena without sort of thinking about what is behind them. You sort of bracket off experience, and I really like this history, actually. So and actually, Gabriel Catrin, who wrote Plurimatica, the book that I have most recently carefully read this past summer, actually stages this nice history. So I'm a big fan of the theological turn in French phenomenology, and there's this short passage in Plurimatica. So I think Catrin is influenced by that, though he's not part of it really. And Messieu is also influenced by it, though he's not part of it really. Because they're both sort of part of this like speculative turn. But okay, let me outline this. So we have Husserl, who sort of points out the frame of the transcendental ego, and then and he's not theological. I'm very curious to read Edith Stein, who is, I think, the first maybe kind of theological-ish phenomenologist, who I think she was his like secretary for a while. Then she wrote a bunch of books, and she's a practicing Christian. Anyway, I'm not sure what she says yet, but I digress. So you have Marion, who's a French thinker, one of the early theological phenomenologists, and his idea is that even more primordial than the transcendental frame, the ego, and its capacities, is givenness, right? That there is a givenness of phenomenality itself, and that like realizing that this givenness is given, that it is a gift that is not actually created by me, it's actually given to me by God. That there is, that's very similar to like Saint Francis of Assisi's insights, with which he founded the Franciscan order. That there is a God, basically, that there is at least a divine givenness of phenomenality. So then you pass from Marion to Michel Henry, and Henry turns the screw an additional turn to posit that that givenness has to refer to something that is not given, but that is also totally unspecified and unspecifiable. And that kind of like gets you into this very kind of trippy degree of abstraction, because it's not, it sort of must be there. It must be other than the givenness of givenness, but it isn't specified in terms of any categories that we know. And so he sort of associates that with God. That kind of turns into the one for Laruelle, who rejects being theological, really, but like that there is basically a one which is just like completely impenetrable to thought. Like thought can say nothing about it, but it sort of in principle has to be there according to the phenomenological method, and that it provides givenness, and that, and then he's very into like, so there's the transcendence of the one, and then there are these transcendentals, which is sort of a sort of naive experience of the world, and then we cut into that with our theory, but not into the one itself. And then you can go a step further, and like I find this idea really kind of amazing. Messieu has a way of approaching this through a whole different, that whole deduction in after finitude. But I feel like I know that he really respects the theological turn in phenomenology, so I kind of wonder, Catherine doesn't talk about this. Perhaps Messieu somewhere puts it this way. He has a different official deduction, but it seems to me that you can turn around and say that thought can actually have a thought of an absolute that is totally impenetrable to thought if you take one additional turn of the screw and suppose that that which gives givenness does not have to give givenness, and it could give other things too. And that is actually very close to his idea of hyperchaos and supercontingency. Anyway, I'll stop there with that. But I think that the Maeschean moment in philosophy is a really strong ground for, with a twisted interpretation or a refined interpretation that kind of goes against what he says, for theology. So anyway, that I associate with Majesty, which is kind of like a hyper Protestant angle of Christianity. It's always teetering on the edge of atheism, which Protestantism does. I think the highest Protestantism is one where you refuse to ever land on a conception of God, and that it almost becomes Gnosticism because there's always a kind of heresy in it. So that's kind of Gnosticism. Fervor is kind of paganism, and Catharsis is kind of rationalism. And then the final potential starting point for thought is, I associate with Balthasar, who is a 20th century theologian. And you can find his idea in earlier theology, but I kind of prefer to refer to a more contemporary theologian to make clear that this is not an idea this isn't a pre-modern idea. This isn't an idea that modernity ever proved to be wrong, because someone was writing about it still in the 80s who's really respected and who understands, who fully understands Kant and Hegel and everybody, and still chooses to believe this, which is basically this is the Christian moment. I identify it with ascesis, and the basic idea is that there is a way to show that all three of those other approaches to philosophy are actually in contradiction with themselves, and that as a result of that, it is reasonable to turn to scripture and dogma, and that basically there is a sort of single authentic path for divine revelation that comes from Scripture and God, and the theological tradition of the Church, and that should be sharply distinguished from reason, right? That reason would never be able to arrive at, the mysteries of the Trinity, for example. And then it should also be sharply distinguished from the poem or the philosophy of the future, like Nietzsche. They're because that is pagan, and paganism has this touch of evil, and so much of what Christianity is in its development is in distinguishing itself from paganism. As this is you can have all kinds of divine reveries, but which ones are actually from God rather than from devils. And so it's similar, and there's that kind of prophetic gift, but then there's still criterion for sort of separating good divine messages from evil ones. And then it's different from Gnosticism / Protestantism as well, for kind of a similar reason, like that Protestantism tends to not take dogma seriously, and that's good. It has this emancipatory quality, or this kind of egalitarian quality, and Gnosticism is different from paganism because Gnosticism is always about sort of turning away from the world. You've got your Quakers, living a simple life, asceticism, whereas the paganism is, more lurid and orgiastic and so forth. But that's different from dogmatic. And I would fit Islam, I think, into that as well. This cuts across all religions. So yeah, anyway, the idea here is that these are 4 incompatible starting points for philosophy, and that there's sort of 4 like genuses or like phyla of starting points, and that you can class anything as starting in one of these places, and that so I guess the sort of bombshell here, which I didn't say at the beginning, is that the correct starting point for philosophy is to examine everything from all 4 of these perspectives. To do your best to do that. And I'll sort of show you how I construct a system combining these insights with the previous insights about the different topics, as well as some more insights that we'll get to in the next one, in the next video. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much all I had to say on this topic. Just last thing I'll say is that we still don't really know what philosophy is, and because there's the tradition of Western philosophy, which is mostly what I've been talking about here, and then there's also just like a wider sense of like this urge to kind of give meaning to history and birth and death, which is more commonly thought of as religious or existential, and there being a kind of void that humans like uniquely have that like animals don't, maybe by virtue of language and that kind of thing. But then it's also like what humanity's emergence from nature sort of is philosophy too, that there's this like non-being out there that we're sort of confronting, and we're sort of trying to impose being on it to make sense of it. And that was so much of sort of what philosophy was about for a while. But that's not even philosophy, that's just like the discipline of philosophy, that's just like civilization is philosophy in a way, and that it sort of creates a clearing, but then underneath that clearing there's this non-being. And for a long time philosophy was about being, and then especially with Nietzsche and Heidegger and Deleuze, as well as like Aleister Crowley and Kenneth Grant and these other people, that like people became much more devoted to non-being actually, and a kind of blossoming that comes from it, but is dangerous. So yeah, anyway, I'm meandering at this point, so I think I will stop. But yes, what is the correct approach to philosophy? There are four. They should be used all at once.